it's really confusing for people who have been victimized as adults because of that sacred trust and because of that relationship and because of an ongoing slow progression of persuasion and breach of boundaries.
The dynamic becomes less about meeting the emotional needs or the spiritual needs of the congregant and more about meeting the needs of the minister. And a characteristic point at which that transition tends to take place is when the minister or cleric starts oversharing, starts talking about his or her, but as I say again, usually his own particular experience. And it's very difficult to put your finger on that. Some people just are very open about their own lives and so on and so forth. You're not quite sure that this is going a little bit too far, but then of course it does.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this Grace Live conversation. We're really, really appreciative that you've taken the time to come and participate in this really important conversation that we'll have. My name is Pete Singer. I'm the Executive Director at Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. We've been around since 2004, and we work to help Christian faith communities better recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse of many forms, many types of abuse. You can find out more about Grace at our website, www.netgrace.org. You can also see some of the videos that we've recorded, the previous webinars that we've done here on our YouTube channel. We do these webinars once a month for a variety of topics. Last month's was polyvictimization, and that's up on our YouTube page, as well as other months. Next month will be non-disclosure agreements, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the program today. Today's conversation is about adult clergy sexual abuse. This is obviously a very significant problem, and it's an issue that the church is struggling with, that we're not doing incredibly well with. And we need to have a conversation. We need to honestly look at what is it, why is it happening, and what can we do about it? Today, we're joined by a couple incredible guests who will help us in this discussion. Please welcome Ray Douglas and Lorianne Thompson, who've agreed to join us today for this conversation. We're honored to have you both join us. Thank you so very much. Did you want to introduce yourselves so that people know who you are?
Sure. My name is Lorianne Thompson, and I am first and foremost a wife and a mother of 4, and I'm in a blended family. I live in Ontario, Canada. By trade and training, I'm a registered kinesiologist, a healthcare professional, and I also hold a master's in child advocacy and policy. I do some lovely work with a legal firm doing intake interviews, and I sit with the bravest people on earth, sexual abuse survivors, including those who have been perpetrated against as adults. I myself have been victimized across a lifespan, and I'm really excited and honored to be with you here today.
Hi, Ray Douglas. My day job is as a professor at Colgate University in the frozen tundra of New York State, where we had just a smidge of snow the night before last. It's an absolute miracle in the second half of April. I also am the head of an outfit called the Foundation for the Study of Male Rape and Sexual Assault, which has its headquarters in Hamilton, New York. I work on a variety of related themes, including publishing on conflict-related sexual violence, and do some consultancy work in terms of trying to prevent campus sexual violence. And last but not least, I am a board member of Grace. Like Lorianne, I had some unfortunate experiences at the hands of a clerical, as it turned out, we later discovered, serial sex offender who'd been doing this for his entire lifetime. So I think we both bring a bit of experiential knowledge to bear, as well as the more academic end of things.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think we're really looking forward to just how much your experience, your knowledge, your wisdom will enrich us all today. And for those of you who are listening, just a reminder that this is a really, really heavy topic, and can be difficult to listen to, can be difficult to hear. So please take care of yourselves during this conversation. Just like the slides were saying at the beginning of the program. And if that means taking some deep breaths, if that means doing some spiritual practices or other practices that you found that help you kind of deal with the heaviness of something like this, then please do that. And if it means taking a break from the program, then please know that you can take a break from the program. The program will be put on our YouTube channel after we're done, so anything that you miss, you'll be able to revisit that content. And so everyone is aware, as far as the format for today, we'll do a conversation amongst Lorianne, Ray, and myself until probably about 2:40 or 2:45, right in there. And then at that point in time, we'll open it up for questions. And so if you wanted to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen, we'll be monitoring for those. We may not be able to get all of those questions in, but if there are any questions that are raised that we're not able to get in, we'll try and respond by email after the program. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And with that, we'll get into this conversation about adult clergy sexual abuse, something that is just far too common. When I think of a clergy person, I don't automatically think of somebody who might be crossing these sexual boundaries. And many clergy people don't. But at the same time, in their book, Sexual Abuse by Clergy, A Crisis for the Church, Marie Fortune and James Poling point to research that indicates that upwards of 10% of clergy violate sexual boundaries with congregants or parishioners under their care at some point. And it's hard to get real concrete, well-established research on it. So somewhat we're not entirely certain what the numbers are, but if they're anywhere around that 10%, and even if they're not up that high, or as some research indicates, potentially higher, this is a serious problem that has to be dealt with. It's a big deal. So just as we start this conversation, can you even just help us understand, what do we mean by adult clergy sexual abuse, and what are some of the dynamics that come into play around that?
Well, clergy sexual abuse has to be one of the singular most confusing things to occur to adults. Obviously, we're talking about adults being the victims in this circumstance. And so clergy misconduct, as defined by Anson Shoup, is sort of threefold. And Anson Shoup talked about spiritual abuse, financial abuse, and sexual abuse as being part of the compendium of clerical misconduct. And he indicated that you could be sexually abused and financially abused, but underneath of both, and spiritually abused. But if you are sexually abused, you are also spiritually abused. So sexual abuse of a congregant or somebody underneath of the power of a religious professional also creates a profound spiritual abuse and profound spiritual wound. And the definition of clergy sexual abuse isn't much different than sexual abuse in general, other than it's exploiting the trust, this indeed a sacred trust of the trustee, and using your power, your religious power, in order to proceed into sexual exploitation of that individual. That, of course, is in, we know that 95% of all perpetrators are persuasive in nature, and so we know that only 5% of perpetrators are powerful, meaning they overtake individuals physically. Most of us are highly afraid of that 5%, but that's rare. And so the persuasive perpetrator, especially in a religious context, underneath it, that profound sacred trust, is very, very confusing, because grooming can very often look like a normal pastoral relationship. And if you can liken clerical trust to going into a doctor's office. When you go into a doctor's office, you're going there for a particular physical problem. And that physician, that healthcare provider, is there to meet your individual needs. And the healthcare provider may say, we need to do some assessments, please remove your garments. And without question, the person in the healthcare provider's care would do exactly that, because of the great trust that's there. But when we go and we involve ourselves with clerics, we remove our some vulnerabilities. We allow that cleric to minister to deep parts of our souls, and very often they access our bodies through that. It's really confusing for people who have been victimized as adults, because of that sacred trust, and because of that relationship, and because of an ongoing slow progression of persuasion and breach of boundaries. Far too often, in almost 100% of the cases that I have personally seen, this clergy sexual misconduct or abuse is called an affair. An affair only happens between power equal people. So that would be two staff members who hold exactly the same measure of power. And an affair is also something that occurs between consenting adults. And there are many professionals, and I would be one of them, who believe very strongly that consent is not possible in a cleric-congregant relationship. Because of the inherent power differential, that the cleric holds a fiduciary duty to do what's in the best interest of the congregant or the person who's seeking their spiritual care, similar to any other healthcare professional, whether it be a lawyer, a dentist, a doctor, etc. Unfortunately, though, those boundaries are blurred even more in the religious environment, because we have less well-defined roles. What is acceptable and what's not acceptable between the cleric and congregant.
Yeah, and that ambiguity really does open up a lot of risk.
Yes. Yeah.
And then we struggle then to define it. Is it abuse? Is it an affair? I agree with you. If it's between a clergy person and a congregant under their care, that's not going to be a consensual affair. That's going to be clergy abuse. When we were having some of our conversations ahead of time preparing for today, you both shared a lot of insight around dynamics that relate to clergy sexual abuse. And Ray, you had identified three aspects that you thought really related to clergy sexual abuse. Could you maybe give us some of your thoughts on those ideas that relate to clergy sexual abuse?
Well, while we're sitting here, I might even tack in a fourth, and that is, I don't think it would do to understate the extent to which this kind of offending also comprehends the old-fashioned brazen kind to which Florian was briefly referring. Whether it's 5% of cases or more than that, I don't exactly know. But if it was, I was in the 5%. It was the nearest thing to a stranger attack, but certainly a surprise physical attack. And one of the, I suppose, obstacles in terms of people being able to report this kind of thing is that the perpetrator, by virtue of his or her, though usually his, standing in the church community, when something seems to be too stereotypical, it almost becomes unbelievable and unreportable on that very ground alone. You just couldn't believe that somebody could act in such an appallingly crude and reckless way. And yet over and over again, we see examples of people doing exactly that and getting away with it for that reason. It just seems too bizarre or out there. But there is, of course, a whole spectrum, as we've said, going all the way across from sexual relationships to romantic relationships to jokes or wisecracks that have a kind of sexualized tinge to it, to I suppose what we would understand as grooming. In most cases, that tends to involve the isolation of the target, the singling out of a particular person from the rest of the faith community for whether it be grooming, whether it be descriptions of how the person involved is so much more attuned with the objectives of the church or the congregation, ways to draw them in by, for example, asking them to take on particular tasks that provide the opportunity for that kind of one-on-one interaction. It also can take the form of expanding on a pastoral relationship where very often people are going to have a kind of one-on-one interaction with a priest or pastor or minister, and that's right and proper and necessary. But at some point in the exchange, so to speak, the dynamic becomes less about meeting the emotional needs or the spiritual needs of the congregant and more about meeting the needs of the minister. And a characteristic point at which that transition tends to take place is when the minister or cleric starts oversharing, starts talking about his or her, but as I say again, usually his own particular experience. And it's very difficult to put your finger on that. Some people just are very open about their own lives and so on and so forth. You're not quite sure that this is going a little bit too far, but then of course it does.
Yeah, that ambiguity again. Go ahead.
No, I agree with everything that Ray has said, and I also just wanted to say that we were talking about in our preliminary conversations, why is it confusing for people to see from the outside looking in, if it was any other individual or even any other professional, if your family doctor was asking to reach out to you privately on WhatsApp and share his or her, but most of the time his marital struggles, or indicating that you were the best patient that he ever had, or clearly you understand the strains of the medical practice more than anybody else, and that you had even if you were part of the healthcare, even if you yourself were a healthcare provider, as a patient, that role is still very much defined, and in any other circumstance we would find the behavior of grooming to be very very awkward, very, why is that person contacting me? But in many cases, my own as well as the ones that I sit with, not infrequently, victims prior to the what we would call traumatic sexualization of the trust relationship. So prior to that, they just feel very special and very cared for, and like, what a wonderful pastor. And he may have given gifts, and he may have come specifically to an area of vulnerability, whether it's a historical one or a present one, as in a felt need of an ill child, or the death of a loved one, or a major move, or in a particularly vulnerable time in a woman's life after she's had a baby, or very often when she's having marital struggles, or if she's trying to process, where was God when I was abused as a child. These are all openings. And very often, victims can be also partnered, adult victims can be partnered, and their partner is often relieved that somebody is facilitating the care of the person that's struggling. So their spouse or their partner is like, yeah, of course. I mean, you're allowed to have a close confidant, and isn't it wonderful that Pastor so and so is showering you with attention because you really need it, and that blind trust, we're blind to the betrayal in our midst, mostly because we presume that something untoward could never come from Pastor so and so or Reverend so and so or Father so and so. And so we often confuse what is grooming with actual pastoral care. And I think that for two reasons. One, the groomer knows the end that he has in mind. The victim has absolutely no idea where this is going. Right? So
Yeah.
in hindsight, after the traumatic sexualization, after they have taken what was a sacred relationship and they have sexualized it, which alone is a betrayal trauma, even if nothing else happens past that, when they traumatically sexualize the relationship, it's only in hindsight that most victims go, oh gosh, you know, he dropped into my home, or he came when my husband wasn't home, or he asked me to come to his home, or I babysat his kids, or we would go on work trips together and I would be the only volunteer that goes, or we would stay at the Airbnb and everybody else was, you know, it all looks like it's some sort of happy family until it's deeply and profoundly traumatic. And that's part of why pastoral care and grooming is so can be so conflated.
Yeah, and I liked a couple of key points that you raised in that too, because you talked about how the clergy person in essence was drafting other people to even help with that grooming, drafting the husband to say, yeah, good that you have that close confidant. And it confuses it even more, because then if the person who is being targeted is having some red flags, but yet other key people in their lives are saying it's okay, it makes it even harder to trust that. And the clergy person, it often is intentionally doing that to overcome the red flags that might be coming up.
Absolutely, and we may or may not speak to this, but at some point in some dialogue, we should talk about the impact then on the partner of the person who's been overtaken by either the powerful or the persuasive clerical predator. That's a secondary trauma. There's a secondary victim, but also there's a profound breach of trust for their partner as well.
Yeah, that's something that we're hoping to have on our schedule later this year, actually. So yeah, you're spot on that we need to address that, because there are so many people that are hurt, just hurt terribly by this. And then seeing that hurt hopefully prompts us to say, what can we do about it? And I think that there's things that can be done both at an organizational level, so things that a church or a denomination or a ministry can do, or that leadership can do. And then there's also things that congregants, everyday people who are coming to this church or involved in this ministry can do. Can you two help us understand? Let's start first with, what are some of the things that an organization, a church, denomination can do to help guard against clergy sexual abuse and to help increase the chance of a better response if clergy sexual abuse occurs? Bree, do you have some thoughts?
Well, let me come at that from a slightly different angle. We can talk, and we will talk, about ways in which churches or denominations can set policies and procedures in place that minimize this kind of thing going undetected. But another very important part of the solution is preventing it from happening in the first place. And that goes very much to the question of formation of ministers, priests, so on and so forth. I am myself Catholic, and I can tell you that in the seminaries, basically nothing is being done to address this in the syllabus, in the process of formation of priests. If seminarians, priests in training, are told anything about the possibility of sexual or romantic, shall we say, complications arising with the congregation, it is entirely in the sense that here is a danger that you have to protect yourself against. In other words, that you are likely to be the source of an approach or seduction by predatory congregants. So this is something that we simply don't teach by and large. The ways in which this kind of thing can occur. And when we're talking about clerical offenders, thus far we have been talking, I suppose, in very broad outlines, particularly about kind of confirmed offenders, repeat offenders, or people who are likely to become repeat offenders. But if you don't know yourself as a minister, as a priest, what are the boundaries between legitimate, proper pastoral activity and when it starts becoming something really problematical, then everybody's in trouble. So the first thing that I would like to see done is taking this kind of thing really seriously in the formation process.
Yeah, sorry, Peter.
No, you go ahead.
I apologize. I thought I was pointing my finger going, yes, yes, when you were talking, Ray. At an institutional level, where seminarians are trained, whether it's in a Bible college or through another denomination, entirely different, it is that feeds into the narrative of it. It's the woman you gave me. I mean, that's as old as the Christian scripture itself, right? So who actually holds the power and who doesn't? And so we actually darvo the people we're supposed to serve. We say, oh, well, that couldn't, you couldn't possibly be a perpetrator because you're actually here to serve them. And
Can you define Darvo?
yeah, I am. So we deny.
Okay.
We deny that it's even possible that a cleric could possibly sexually offend against one of their congregants. That it actually places the cleric in a position of powerlessness. They don't understand the power that they hold in many cases, or they learn from seminarian that they themselves could be tempted. And we couch predation in terms of religious language instead of actual reality. So Darvo is when we deny that an incident of sexual abuse incident or context has occurred, and then we attack the victim. We say, actually, it wasn't the offender, it was the victim's fault. She came on to me, she came to my office, she was the one who wanted me, she pursued me, and then you can insert whatever adjective about that woman. We can make that really ugly in religious circles. She has a Jezebel spirit, etc., etc. And then we reverse the victim and offender, and the offender actually becomes the victim. Well, the poor man, how he ministry is fatiguing. Poor him. He was just so tempted, or worse. That's the mildest version that I can give you. And so, at an institutional level, we actually create a situation where these clerks are coming into their service believing that vulnerable people, or people who are vulnerable under their power, under their care, will actually be able to overpower them through their wiles, through their temptation. And actually, it's numerous things. It's an underestimation of their own religious and sacred power, and it is a vilification of victims. It's also a vilification of women. In general, because heaven forbid a woman and a man be alone in the same room together, she may overtake him with her feminine wiles. When indeed what happens is that women are pursuing spiritual healing as opposed to a sexualized relationship. And if most clerics did what they were supposed to do when they were supposed to do it, instead of taking liberties with these women, they would not be in this situation. So I'm part of the College of Kinesiologists of Ontario, and my college is regulatory, and my college says that I cannot engage in any type of personal misconduct with one of the people that I see. And the college is there to protect the public. The college is not there to cover my backside, my professional backside. The college is there because they understand that I, as a health professional, am in a position of power over the people that I care for. And this goes back to the very thing that Ray indicated, that I was nodding my head so emphatically and shaking my finger to yes, is that there's a poor understanding that of the power dynamic, that the clergy is actually the person in power and the congregant is the person underneath of that power, whether that's whether that's in staff, that's a pastor and an associate pastor, or a pastor and a youth pastor. Clergy sexual abuse doesn't just have to be a congregant, it can also be within the ministry team or volunteer itself.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that that power differential, the power gradient, does exist, and it exists to a greater or lesser degree in some denominational or organizational setups than others, which is not necessarily to say that the danger is greatest, so to speak, with ones that are theologically conservative or theologically liberal. That's not quite how it works. It's a bit more complicated than that. But it is also true to say that the work of ministry is fatiguing and draining and emotionally fraught. And if somebody does not have a means of coping with that, of handling the stresses of the job, which can be impossible because people have very high expectations of their spiritual leaders. If they're not able to deal with those stresses, those emotional burdens in ways that don't involve improper or abusive relationships with congregants or other members of the church community, then that is a road to disaster, so to speak. So when I speak about education, formation, and so on and so forth, I think it's not merely a matter of having a checklist of avoid this, avoid that, avoid the other thing. Make sure that there is always somebody else in the room, what has sometimes been called the Billy Graham rule, and so on and so forth. Avoid what a Catholic would call the near occasions of sin. That won't actually get the job done. It's much more a question of figuring out how the entire life of ministerial leadership, the entire lifestyle, if you will, can be accommodated in a healthy, moral, Christian way.
This is really important because I think what you're talking about is the culture and the values that develop around clergy. And you're also, in many of the comments that both of you have made, talking about the culture in the church itself. And you've both pointed out that maybe some of these things are steps that people are taking, but they're not actually going to get to the root of the problem. And maybe these are steps that people are taking, but they're not going to get to the root of the problem. And part of that is because the root of the problem we have to address is the culture of our churches and the culture of ministry. And it's not about a checklist of do's and don'ts. It's about actually recognizing that this relates to who we are in Christ. This relates to our very identity as the church. It's not a side thing. It is central, it is core. And until we actually realize that our identity as believers, our identity as children of God is reflected in this, we're not going to give it the attention and the priority that it deserves.
Agreed.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, agreed. I think we have a profound, we are sick. The body of Christ is profoundly sick. And how we do ministry as a general rule, there probably are pockets of health. I give people that. But as a general rule, it is profoundly distorted. Under any other circumstances, the boundaries that are crossed would never be crossed in any other regulated profession.
Part of
So,
that,
go ahead.
part of that comes from the ground up, so to speak. In other words, what the congregation wants their leader and or leaders and their image to be. We talk in the Catholic Church where the hierarchical gradient is extremely steep. I mean, effectively vertical. Brief structure of the Catholic Church for beginners. The parish priest is essentially the Pope within his own parish. The bishop is essentially the Pope within his own diocese. And then the Pope is the Pope, presumably within the opportunity to bang the heads of all the others together. But because there's only one Pope and there are 400,000 priests worldwide, that doesn't happen terribly often. What tends to happen is that we speak of a culture of clericalism, that we project onto our religious leaders the desirable attributes that we want to have as a faith community and that we want to project to others as a faith community. And that's something very difficult even for a priest or minister to break out of. The desire of the congregation to want him or her, again, usually him, to be a particular kind of person, ministering in a particular kind of way that may very well, as Lorianne has said, have deeply pathological elements to it.
Wow. There are definitely things that we need to do at the organizational level around asking questions about hierarchy, about the use of power, policies and procedures that are absolutely essential, and looking at the very culture of our church. But there's also individual things that we can do. We want to start on questions in maybe about 5 minutes or so, but what would each of you say are maybe one or two key things that a congregant can do? This doesn't necessarily need to be a person with a bunch of power or leadership roles in a church, but a person that is coming to this church. What can they do for prevention and response?
Very often the victim of clergy sexual abuse feels complicit in their own abuse. And so rarely do victims come to a person and disclose that they have been abused. Most of the time, if it's been a persuasive predator. It does often take time for the victim to realize that, oh goodness, this is what happened. Sometimes it happens years later. And so I think one of the things, if you are hearing a disclosure or you're aware of clergy sexual abuse that's occurred, that you hear that through the lens of the power differential, and you actually don't go, oh, well, yeah, right, you are having an affair with the pastor, you rotten, horrible human being. Actually, you need to hear that through through the power differential, and so that you are informed and that you listen without blame. And when I say that, listen without blame, I also mean don't spread the blame around. Like, well, you're equal to blame as the pastor in this situation because, and they're not. Also, additionally, encourage safe reporting. And so invariably, I'll be blunt because we're short on time, try to report to somebody outside of the religious system. Find a therapist, call Grace, find somebody who is not part of your church, who has no affiliation with your church or your religious community. Find somebody to disclose who has nothing to gain or lose by your disclosure and who hopefully knows what they're talking about.
And this can be especially important because in many states, when a clergy person has a sexual relationship with a congregant or with somebody that is seeing them for pastoral counseling, it's actually illegal. And that is something that the police would want to know because that person has violated the law.
At the moment in 13 states and the District of Columbia. Now, the exact nature of those laws vary. Some of them criminalize sexual relationships specifically occurring within a pastoral counseling context. Others are much more broadly drawn and come fairly near to say that any sort of sexual relationship with the congregant is against the law. The laws are still evolving in this respect, but yes, there's definitely a dynamic in the direction of the civil authorities paying much more attention to this. The best advice I could give to somebody who is just sitting in the pews and wondering what to do is be the squeaky wheel. Say that we need to talk about this as a congregation. We need to educate ourselves about this. We need a policy on this, and keep being annoying until somebody actually does something.
Yeah, I love that. The squeaky wheel does get the grease, but it's also just so important because it's establishing that this is a priority for the church. And so for many churches, it's that person who will not accept an excuse. It's that person who will not be quiet that can serve as the catalyst, that advocate that first helps that church start to make the growth and the change that they need to better reflect the heart of God. Thank you both for your thoughts, your wisdom, and sharing that with us today. I want to get to a few questions that have come in. I'm going to mention that we have had an awful lot of questions come in, and we're not going to be able to get to them all. So please, if we did not get to your question, if you could please email info@netgrace.org, and I think Zane had that up in the chat earlier, but info@netgrace.org, and said that say that it's a question that you had following the Grace Live conversation with Lorianne and Ray, and we'll do our best to get back to that as quickly as possible. But a couple of questions that we can get to. Do you have any thoughts? A lot of times this is something that there is like a big taboo when it comes to talking about this. We can't even bring it up as a subject of conversation, and it's hard to be that voice that won't be quiet if we can't even talk about it in the first place. Any thoughts from either of you two? How can we break this veil of silence? How can we get through this taboo?
Right. This is part of it, right? This is part of it. But go ahead, Ray.
In many cases, unfortunately, the opening salvo of the conversation is going to be fired by the civil authorities. The fact of the matter is, it's a sad thing to say, but when it comes to sexual wrongdoing, churches all pretty much across the board, just about 100%, do not spontaneously do the right thing themselves. They do the right thing when something goes disastrously wrong, and now you have people with guns and uniforms banging on the door, or people in striped suits handing out writs and this kind of thing. To put it at the crudest or most basic level, no church or denomination can get away for very much longer not talking about this, because the civil authorities are going to find a way of tapping you on the shoulder very hard indeed and getting your attention in a way that you won't like. So you either do the right thing even for the wrong reasons, or somebody will do it for you, but it's going to get done.
Peter, I think that I know that there's a lot of difficulty, but I think since at least our time, the public conversation has started to change. What I think is very important to remember is that when people have been victimized, their voice has been stolen, it's been silenced. But more and more, as survivors are coming forward, at least within the survivor community, there is some solidarity in disclosure, safe disclosure. And so there are people who will believe you if you have been victimized. You have to find them, but there are people who will believe you because they themselves have had that experience. The culture at large is changing. I think the church is being dragged into it, but I do see some deeply decent people who are wanting to make things safer. It is definitely a salmon swimming upstream, though.
Yeah, it's it is changing. I agree, and I think I've seen some of that change too, and it gives me hope. I wish it were a lot faster. It needs to be a lot faster, and it needs to be more. But I would say I am more frequently getting a call from a church calling up that is saying, we want to respond well because this person needs us to respond well. We want to respond well because the leader needs to be held accountable. We want to respond well because we don't want to hurt more people. And I'm seeing that type of a response, as opposed to we need to respond well so that the media doesn't think we're a bunch of bad people. We need to respond well because that person's making false accusations. So I've seen some gradual shift, not enough shift, but some shift in the conversations that we're having with churches anyway, to where there is that change that you're talking about, I think, starting to emerge.
But as you said just there, I think you used the word respond about 5 or 6 different times in that sentence. And tragically, that tends to be the way it works.
Respond.
Indeed, people wait until something ghastly has occurred and goes public. And at that point, then yes, they want to know how to handle the situation well, and it is commendable that they do, but how much more commendable to have been proactive and make sure that it was less likely to happen in the first place. And one of the nice things about having policies is that it takes people off the hook. Actual written policies that can be pointed to and appealed to, that you don't have to engage in a whole how should I put it? You don't have to decide on the fly under the most stressful possible circumstances when the church community or the board of elders or the parish council or the entire congregation are completely freaked out, traumatized, and probably never going to be less equipped to make good decisions than they will be in that particular moment. How much better it would be to try and get out ahead of things when you're not dealing with this kind of crisis situation and everybody is stressed to the max.
Yeah, very true. Prevention, to stop it in the first place, better.
Or at the very least, to have game planned what if we are talking about responsiveness, what a good response looks like in advance, rather than learning by making all the mistakes possible.
Yeah, exactly. Another question that came up, and I know that there are many more that are there that I'm afraid that we are just not going to be able to get to today. But again, please, if we did not get to your question, please do email them to us at info@netgrace.org. But so for a pastor that is in whether it's a counseling relationship or some other type of pastoral relationship with a congregant, can you help us understand this idea? Why is it that the pastor is responsible for watching those boundaries? Why is it that the pastor is responsible for discerning possible intent? So that's number one. And then number two, also, how can the pastor be watchful of themselves?
Ray, do you mind if I start?
Please do.
Okay. So the pastor is in a position of fiduciary duty. He is responsible to do what is in the best interest of those that he's serving, whether it's his employees or his congregation, or even, truthfully, the public at large, because of the sacred position that he holds. It is always the power holder's job to maintain the boundaries in the relationship, irrespective of the conduct or the intent or the transference or the emotional attachment, or you name it, add anything to the list of the congregant or the person who is under their care. If they are under their care for any reason, if the power differential is there, then they're responsible. The cleric, the professional, is responsible to maintain the boundaries and the integrity of that relationship, including terminating that relationship if it's not in the best interest of the person they're trying to serve.
Yeah, those are, as a therapist, same rules apply to me. I'm the one with more power in the relationship, more of an ability to misuse power. And therefore that responsibility does rest with me.
Entirely.
I can, though, imagine pastors listening to what we're saying and thinking to themselves, well, what are you expecting me to do? People are coming to me in crisis. They've got all these problems that they want to tell me about. They don't want it broadcast to the parish, and they're calling me up late at night, and I have to handle this somehow. What really do you expect of me? What do you want of me? My own answer to that question would be yes. I understand the problems and the pressures and the impossible demands that are sometimes being placed upon you. But firstly, it is paramount. If your formation hasn't dealt with this kind of thing explicitly, you badly need some postgraduate training. Go out and get it as a matter of urgency. Because if you haven't thought your way through these things, to how boundaries can become difficult for you to observe or notice, never mind a member of the flock, then trouble is absolutely on the horizon. Secondly, how does your ministerial life fit in with your life in general? How are you able to put on your own oxygen mask spiritually and emotionally before ministering to others? And thirdly, I know I made a minor sort of sideswipe at the Billy Graham rule, but a good rule of thumb is, when you're engaging with somebody in a pastoral context, is, what if what you were saying and doing were being live streamed all the time? Would you be comfortable with that? If you wouldn't be, then red flags should be popping up.
Yeah, super important. And to figure out what those boundaries are. And, like, for example, at Grace, we have different boundaries that we expect people to adhere to, but they're not gendered boundaries. So they're boundaries that just apply regardless of gender, so that there then isn't the result doesn't end up being that one gender gets favor over another based on the safety boundaries that are there. So they're non-gendered. But yeah, setting those boundaries, training, incredibly urgent. Well, we have to wrap up. I wish we could stay on longer. I could listen to both of you. You just have so much wisdom and insight, and I greatly, greatly appreciate you sharing it with all of us. And thank you again, everyone, for coming. Remember too that when we talked about self-care, that wasn't just for during the program. And I would encourage you tonight or right after the program or when it works for you, but at some point today, to really be thinking and mindful of self-care, caring for yourself. And that might be talking to someone that you trust about how this program went today and about what you learned and how you felt during the course of this program. And it might mean some of those other steps that we've talked about, but please do take care of yourselves. I also want to mention that next month, when we talk about non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement agreements, we'll have two incredible guests, Scott McKnight and Boz Chividjian. So both Scott McKnight and Boz will be on to talk about non-disclosure agreements and related agreements that would limit the sharing of knowledge. Again, thank you everyone for coming out today. We really appreciated having you here, and thank you, Ray and Lorianne. Bye, everyone.